Thank you so much, Ben. So, this thematic session is the first ever Global Protection Cluster session that focuses on the range of uses of new and digital technologies and the role these technologies play in shaping the protection environment and response. Digital technologies are an integral part of our contemporary life, including the lives of those affected by armed conflict, other situations of violence, and other humanitarian settings, such as displacement. We're able to gather today using a digital platform supported by translators. Right now, some of you are probably also scrolling on a smartphone, catching up on news or messages while listening to this conversation take place. New and digital technologies are reshaping the conduct of warfare and how protection actors respond to humanitarian emergencies. Digital technologies offer the potential for dynamic and inclusive responses, the scaling of community engagement, and the enabling of people's resilience by improving their access to services. At the same time, these changes in society and in the protection operational landscape also comes with new or amplified protection risks. We are joined today by 6 panelists, which you can see on the screen, whose vast experience will guide us through today's discussion. I encourage you to read their bios that's now being put in the chat. We hope to bring you through a journey reflecting on protection in the digital age. Before we jump into today's discussion, I want to give you 3 thoughts for today. First, enjoy the session. We will cover a very diverse range of topics. Each one could be its own session. We hope you have the chance to learn something new. We have a very busy agenda today, where you're welcome to leave comments and questions in the chat. Second, I encourage you to think carefully about how we describe and how we promote digital technologies, including artificial intelligence, AI, in the way we work. And finally, reflect on how digital technologies are reshaping the lives of the people we work with and the local organizations we work alongside. With that, let's get started. So first, I'm going to go to Joël. Thank you for getting us started today. While we are all aware of the value of digital technologies in our own day-to-day lives, I think we are beginning to understand more that advanced technologies are shaping the lives of people affected by violence, or they might even be the driver of some of this violence. As ICRC's Digital Risks Advisor, you sit in the ICRC Protection Department. You are uniquely placed to explain to us why should we be thinking of digital risks and protection risks. Over to you.
Thank you, Veronique, and thanks everyone for having me with you here today. I was instructed to speak clearly and slowly, but there's a lot to cover, so please let me know if I need to slow down or to hurry up, depending on time. I'll start by just analyzing a little bit with you all why we are speaking, to begin with, of digital risks before we go into why they are protection risks. And there are 3 patterns or 3 sort of reality changes that we need to account for in our operational realities today that maybe 20 years ago we didn't have to, or 25 years ago we didn't have to. First is the fact that conflicts today, armed conflicts and situations of violence, the way that they happen and that they evolve, involve a lot of digitalization through the way that operations are conducted, the means and methods of warfare, but also the way that states and other actors are employing different tools for their operations. So the digitalization of that landscape is something that us as protection actors really need to reflect on. How does that change the way that we behave or the way that we perceive vulnerability if people are affected or the risks that they are exposed to? Second, another reality check also that we need to integrate in our protection analysis and our protection thinking is the fact that the essential services that people depend on and are increasingly also depending on digital technologies and on data. And within that, the interconnectedness of people to these services and of services and systems one to the other in a way that people depend more and more on being connected in order to also access services, and services depend on being connected and on data in order to function. And then third, which is also a very important consideration, especially for protection actors, is that a lot of the work that we ourselves do depends on data collection and on data processing and on digital tools, whether for mediating the delivery of our humanitarian work or for doing our analysis in our work and case management, etc., ourselves. So in a sense, the very tools that we use ourselves and the way that we interact with people is also depending on digital technologies. And every time we say this is digitalized or that is dependent on connectivity or that is dependent on data, inevitably there is a risk attached to that because it is exposed to various behaviors that maybe impact either putting us in a situation where we ourselves become a vector for harm for people, or we're in a situation where data, for example, could be misused and so on. We'll go over these type of examples in a second. So before I go over the examples, let's think of digital risks in the next hour and a half. Let's think of digital risk as risks that are enabled by the use of new or digital technology and or digital technologies, and that might have consequences on the rights of people, their safety, or their dignity. And of course, we're talking about that in situations of either armed conflict or other situations of violence. So in other words, we're thinking of the use of digital technologies by states and non-state actors in ways that can lead to harmful effects on people. We're thinking about the use of digital technologies by humanitarian actors, so by ourselves in our programmatic deliveries and so on, in ways and when they may become a vector for harm or exposing the vulnerability of people. So think, for example, of potential data mishandling or misuse or data breaches. And then finally, we're thinking of, and that is often overlooked, the interaction of civilians and people themselves with that digital space, whether it is to access services or whether it is to use tools that may actually bring them closer to conflict environment and to conflict activities, such as for gathering information or for spreading certain information campaigns and narratives. In more specific terms, for the ICRC today and in the Protection Department, we have tried to break this down to a few key concerns. And we broke them down to about 4 or 5, but of course, under each one of these, there's a lot of more details to unpack. But for the sake of simplicity, I'll keep it packaged in 4 or 5 key concerns. First is the spread of harmful information, whether this is hate speech or disinformation or information campaigns that become themselves a violation of international humanitarian law. That is the first set. Second is connectivity disruptions or restrictions. That includes the intentional or non-intentional disruption of connectivity and access to connectivity for people, such as, for example, internet shutdowns or communication blackouts. Imagine that happening in situations of armed conflict or crisis settings and how that may impact both humanitarian operations and people's ability to maintain services and family contact, etc. Third is the cyber operations and cyber activities that target either infrastructure or target individuals or humanitarian organizations. And of course, in that bubble of concern in relation to cyber activities and operations, we also think about how non-state actors or how even civilians may become involved in armed conflict when they themselves conduct certain cyber activities, such as, for example, if you think about activist groups or other non-state actors that are involved in cyber activities. Fourth, I will mention a plethora of risks actually, but under the umbrella of AI-enabled or risks enabled by the deployment of and adoption of artificial intelligence tools, whether this is in warfare, so for example, for making decisions during military operations, or whether this is in law enforcement operations or border management or in detention settings, etc. So under the banner of different adoption of AI tools and AI agents integrated into operations, this is really a whole plethora of issues that, depending on the applicability and the setting. And then finally, we keep also track of other evolutions in technologies, and that is something that we keep an eye on in the sense of what are additional uses of technologies or new technologies or repurposed tools or digital tools that we observe in conflict. One example on that would be the proliferation of use of drones, for example. So within these concerns, there are a few trends that I would like to share with the audience before we go into the specific speeches and examples and cases by the other colleagues. Is based on an observation of hundreds of examples of the use of technology, especially in armed conflict, but also in other situations of violence, but majority of the cases that we've looked at are in armed conflict. I want to share a few of the observations that we have found in these cases. First is that if you look at different types of uses of digital technologies or digital operations, the most common types that we see having a bigger impact in situations of armed conflict is the spread of harmful information, followed by cyber operations, and then followed by restrictions on connectivity. Doesn't mean one is more important than the other. It's just that this is sort of the observation that we had in terms of how often they happen and the kind of impact they have. Second is that there is a significant, I would say, sharp rise in activities, in cyber activities by dozens of cyber actors, mostly non-state cyber actors or hacktivist groups or hacker groups in early stages of a conflict escalation. So in the earlier stages of a conflict erupting, especially in the last few years, we see that there's a sudden sharp rise in different cyber activities. And then third is that we observed that the key targets or the main targets of different type of operations, whether it's harmful information or cyber operations or other, we see that repeatedly people, individuals, communities, and even humanitarian workers and organizations, they're often a target, followed by cyber operations or other operations targeting infrastructure, even if it's mostly civilian infrastructure. And also targeting data, including humanitarian data. So if you think about all of that, all of these are really serious behaviors or serious situations that will have consequences either on the protection workers or also on the on people affected by conflict, and in a way that in either case, in a way that requires a protection response and protection actors to be ready to deliver on such responses. Other quick trends that we observed, as I've already mentioned, is the involvement of civilians, whether they are hackers or tech companies or ordinary civilians through digital tools, the involvement or becoming closer to conflict. So think about civilians using repurposed apps, for example, for the collection of information or otherwise. The second is also that there is a really rapid adaptation rapid adoption of AI tools and AI applications in various sectors, as I mentioned earlier, including in conflict, in law enforcement, in detention settings, in border management, so on and so forth. So this raises a lot of questions for protection actors on what is their role in influencing that behavior or limiting the impact of such adoption when identified, and how do we even identify those impacts? And also finally is to say that there are new actors for protection actors to have dialogue with or to try to influence. And these are specifically cyber actors, as I mentioned earlier, and tech companies. They might not be our usual type of interlocutors and actors to influence, but in addition to the work that a lot of protection actors do with states or with non-state armed groups or with communities, we also need to think of potential work to be done with these new type of actors. I will close on saying and reminding that throughout all these examples and all different types of uses of tech in armed conflict and other situations of violence, oftentimes we ask, is there really humanitarian consequences? Is it really additional or different, and how serious such consequences might be? And I want to say that, again, looking at a lot of examples that we've looked at the ICRC, is that the consequences are very real, and we've tried to map them out, and they influence the treatment of people, from threats online to harassment to facilitation of violations, such as facilitation of recruitment of children or use of children in armed conflict, all the way to arbitrary arrests. But we also see significant psychological harms on people, including re-traumatization, but also anxiety and fear, We also see significant economic and financial harms that especially when people are not able to access certain services or lose access to opportunities. But of equal importance, if not more, is also the physical harm that we observe on people, including death and injury, and all the risk of death and injury as well, specifically when it comes to direct consequences in times of armed conflict and escalation of violence or the incitement to violence. But we also have observed that there's a lot of deprivation of harms where people's access to information or access to essential services, including life-saving services and health services, and deprivation of humanitarian assistance becomes also a reality that is facilitated potentially by data-related risks or information-related risks or cyber-related risks. So in every sense, this is really part and parcel of the operational realities that we deal with as protection actors and that we need to think of. And I'll close on encouraging everyone to look at Chapter 8 of the Professional Standards for Protection Work, where we unpack a lot of these risks, but also try to set some standards on how can we as protection actors integrate this into our protection analysis, into identifying the vulnerability of people in the context where we are, but also trying to identify what possible mitigation measures may be, or what improving risk awareness, or improving resilience and self-protection measures, or even prevention of harm and diminishing the threats by changing the behavior of actors. So really there's an array of options for protection workers to see where they may be most relevant. So let's think of digital risk as protection risks, but also of protection work on digital risk as work that addresses those risks to people when they are enabled by the use of specific technologies, or because of the way that actors involved in conflict and other situations of violence themselves are behaving in that space or in that domain. I hope that's a good framing and intro. Back to you, Veronique.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joelle. Indeed, I think it's a really good introduction, reminding us that there are different types of changes that lead to different types of key concerns, that there are quite a wide range of trends, but also new actors that we as protection actors not engage with. And I think your closing around really thinking of these as having humanitarian consequences is really critical. So thank you so much. I'm now going to turn to Paul. Paul, I understand as a protection actors, we often focus on more harmful behaviors, and I think Joelle has given us quite a good overview of that. But I wanted to start us today discussing the more positive sides, potentially, of digital technologies and how digital technologies may support a protection response. So your organization, Shabaka, published a report this year on the use of mutual aid to support people in crisis in Sudan. Can you tell us more about mutual aid and the role of technology in enabling people outside of Sudan to help people inside Sudan? Over to you.
Thank you, Veronique, and good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening to our audience, depending on where you are in the world. It's an honor to be with you here today. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, my organization, Shabaka, we're a diaspora-led humanitarian research organization. A lot of our work is focused on humanitarian actors that operate outside or at the margins of formal humanitarian systems, typically local responders, mutual aid groups, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute in the Sudanese context, as well as diaspora humanitarians. And although, just to clarify as well, we're not a Sudanese diaspora organization per se, but our founder and many of our colleagues are Sudanese diaspora. And certainly since the outbreak of the conflict in Sudan in April 2023, much of our work has been focused on trying to support mutual aid groups in Sudan and improve the information flow and coordination with formal humanitarian actors and systems. I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes about some of the humanitarian aspects of tech use, and I think there's a lot of positives, but there's also a lot of challenges. But then I'm going to hand over to my colleague and an old partner of Shabaka's from Andrea, the Sudanese organization. It's a fantastic partner, Omnia Shaukat, who'll talk a little bit about some of the digital harms and challenges that are faced by people within Sudan on the ground, communities and civil society. It'll come as no surprise that, as in all crisis contexts nowadays, use of digital tools has become critical for local responders and diaspora humanitarians to share critical information and updates on community needs, changes in the security situation, especially at the local level, coordination of activities critically, and also moving money into Sudan and within Sudan. And that's been something that's been quite interesting for us to track over the last few years, has been the growth of use of mobile banking within Sudan, particularly as the banking system has come under massive pressure. There have been attacks, looting, there's been a cash crisis in Sudan. But I just want to kind of focus really on the local responders who've been doing such amazing work in response to what is the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet by pretty much every indicator. Over 30 million people, so over half the population, are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. You've got IPC level 5 famine affecting approximately 700,000 people in parts of the country. 75% of the country's healthcare infrastructure has been destroyed by the conflict parties. And since within hours of the outbreak of the conflict on the 15th of April 2023, mutual aid groups in Sudan, and this includes formal and informal emergency response rooms, which you may have heard about within the media, but also community kitchens, community-based organizations, women's and faith organizations, local NGOs, student initiatives, and diaspora humanitarians have been active in responding to the crisis. They were sharing and continue to share critical information on safety and evacuations, and they were supporting the evacuation of international staff from Khartoum at the start of the conflict. They've been providing vital life-saving humanitarian activities across all cluster areas. And because of limitations in aid access for international humanitarian partners, in some parts of the country, these mutual aid groups are the only groups able to operate. And what's interesting from our perspective as well is the extent to which their activities have been supported financially by wealthy Sudanese philanthropists, and by the diaspora. We estimate around 90% of the resourcing has come from those two sources alone. Now, specifically when it comes to humanitarian use of tech in the Sudanese context, I think it's important to emphasize that the conflict parties use access to the internet for control, also to raise money from local communities, and to surveil their activities. And online spaces, both within Sudan and outside Sudan, have become key fronts in information wars by the conflict parties and their supporters. And perhaps this is probably a topic for another time, but involving international PR firms and bot farms in different parts of the world who are churning out misinformation and very problematic content. You've probably seen in the media, particularly given the awful events we've seen in Darfur over recent weeks, that online content, for example, atrocity videos, is used to intimidate local communities. We published research in 2024 that highlighted the very severe protection risks faced by local responders who both conflict parties have targeted for harassment, detention, and killing. And when we published the report, 71 Sudanese aid workers had been injured, detained, kidnapped, or killed, compared to 4 international aid workers who were wounded. And tragically, this number will have increased significantly since we published the report. And I think it's important to pay tribute to the memory of all the men and women in Sudan, NGO workers, members of local associations, frontline responders and volunteers who've lost their lives or working to aid others. What's been interesting for us as well is the extent to which electronic money, mobile banking, has become critical to the humanitarian response as well, which links to challenges of internet connectivity and power. I mentioned earlier there have been, earlier in the conflict, attacks on banks, looting. There was a cash crisis. So this led to increasing use of mobile banking, particularly the Banca Khartoum mobile app, both to move money into the country from outside, and that's challenging for various different reasons, depending where you're sending it from, but especially within the country, and also being used increasingly for purchasing things. So it's seen as a safer alternative to cash. But this also paradoxically increases risks to people too, because it's becoming riskier to have a mobile phone. People are having them stolen, people have been attacked for them, etc., etc. When it comes to internet access, also lack of power outages, lack of resources, rising costs, and these increased safety risks, both online and offline, reinforce inequalities for communities within Sudan. And we published some research earlier this year, actually, that showed how communities in Sudan, internet users, have also been exposed to different forms of online and offline human exploitation, including people smuggling and trafficking, sexual exploitation, recruitment of child soldiers, online frauds and scams, and even organ trafficking. And perhaps it's only to be expected, given the scale of the crisis in Sudan, the number of desperate people. You know, we're talking about 13 million people who've been displaced internally or across the borders, who are potential victims of, depending on which way you want to look at it, who are potential customers for certain types of human exploitation services, such as people smugglers. And what we've seen is that in this kind of ungoverned information space online in Sudan, exploiters use a fairly consistent methodology. They'll use virtual hooks in public online spaces. It might be a Facebook group or something like that that's open to the public, to identify and recruit potential victims. They then move them to encrypted platforms for digital grooming prior to taking them offline for isolation, relocation, and coercion. And it's a massive challenge facing communities in Sudan. And one of the challenges as well that I think relates to our discussion here today is the way in which these same digital tools and same public platforms are also used by vulnerable communities and local responders to share key safety information about routes, to warn people about particular people traffickers, for example. And this highlights the ways in which internet connectivity and access to power have become key critical infrastructure for local responders and for crisis-affected communities alike. And this also perhaps explains why the conflict parties are so desperate to control internet access, whether we're talking about through attacks on telecoms or power infrastructure, use of deliberate outages or digital surveillance. I'm going to stop here now and hand over to my colleague Omnia, if that's okay.
Everyone, my name is Omnia Abbas Shaukat. I'm one of two founders of Andariya. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for having us here. I wanted to just kind of continue where Paul left off and ask some questions and maybe answer some things that have arisen in this conversation as well. I think a lot of us know that Sudanese have been using social media to coordinate between them, mutual aids, even protests in the past during the revolution. And after that, the momentum just continued, reaching to the war, where now life-saving information was being shared through WhatsApp, through Telegram. There were large channels where people shared this information, Facebook groups. But because of the heavy surveillance, the targeting, the harassment, and sometimes persecution of activists themselves, the coordinators, the people who are very visible online, a lot of this information is now clustered in encrypted groups, in private communities, and it's understandable from a security standpoint, but has also deteriorated the access to information that has already been compromised by so many other things that Paul has also talked about, and I will touch on in my points. But this critical access to information is almost compounded by the fact that people, due to economic crisis, due to the continuous displacement for some communities, they've lost that access to power. So, you know, starting from shelter, access to power, access to internet, it's extremely expensive to access internet. So more and more people are finding it difficult to find that information because these spaces are now in places that they're not accessible to them. Even there's people using Facebook Live, trying to access information on Facebook, but a lot of the information we used to see from the beginning of the war is no longer accessible right now. And a lot of groups have gone really private. The other thing is that displacement has also left people in a perpetual state of change and constant instability, which has also been compounded by the fact that different places continue to be hit infrastructure-wise. The inflation and the constant attacks on power, water, it has really just put people in such a mayhem state that then their ability to decipher the little information that comes to them is compromised, right? So now we have artificial intelligence, content that is manipulated. As Paul mentioned, there's bot farms. There's a lot of influencers inside Sudan and outside of Sudan that are now being used to manipulate the narrative, to drive ethnic divisions, to spread misinformation. And we're seeing more and more through our social monitoring exercises that these are now very distinct groups that kind of rise up and go down together. And because of the different surveillance, because of people reporting them, there was a huge movement after the war, started to shut down different pages that continue to share atrocities, that continue to share hate speech. But these things are still picking up quite fast. And people, we can say that people are not really used to this kind of information. They're not used to this kind of sophisticated tools. As Paul mentioned, there's coordinated activities that are done on such a high level of content development, of editing, and all of that. So the little that people can have access to, they're now open to exploitation, they're open to manipulation. And then you have that there's entire sort of narratives that have come up over the last two almost 3 years that target aid workers, whether the local aid workers. So other than targeting them through surveillance, there's also targeting them online through rumors, through sort of accusations of bias or espionage. There was that photo, with the RSF, and then there's a Red Cross van behind it. There's all kinds of attempts to dispel the trust in aid workers, whether local and international. And of course, this ends up becoming a bigger problem for access. For example, if one entity is preventing access to aid. So just the last point is that one of the major problems is the complete power shutdown and internet shutdowns that happen sometimes for months in certain areas. And we know from experience that when the lights go out, atrocities happen. And it makes it extremely difficult already, with people being very reserved about documenting human rights, documenting what's happening. It makes it very hard for us to imagine a pathway to justice. We're not able to use these digital tools to document. We're not able to kind of coordinate to have a more sophisticated sort of saving of the files and putting them in clouds and so on. So there's desperate need for digital literacy, digital safety for different actors, including humanitarians, but even media, civil society, because they're being attacked from different places. And these narratives are very strong, and they even cross boundaries from what we're seeing. And it's very easy to detect spikes in different things. So the response should be in Leo. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you, Omnia. I think if anybody had doubts from what Joel was saying about the humanitarian consequences, I think Omnia and Paul have given us quite concrete and harrowing examples of some of the risk. And you've also highlighted where technology can be so helpful in terms of accessing services, banking, information, but then the risk and how it can also make you a target. So that double-edged sword that happens. I see Paul has shared some of the resources in the chat, so please feel free to download these and look at them. Thank you so much for this. I'd like now to go to Verena. Verena, as the GBV Area Responsibility Coordinator in Syria, you have also seen the role that technology has in supporting community-led organization. In your experience, could you share with us how is technology reshaping women's led organization? And sorry, just before I hand over to you, I saw there was a hand up earlier. Unfortunately, because of the time and the fact that we have these amazing panelists, we will not be able to take questions, but please do put your questions and comments in the chat. Over to you, Verena.
Thank you so much, Veronique, and really exciting to be here with all of you today. I hope you can hear me well. A lot has been shared already on the good help and the good practices on using technology for protection purposes. So it's also a learning experience, right, for all of us. From the GBV side, especially in rapidly evolving emerging context, we can make a very good use of technology to facilitate of course, GBV response and also coordination between GBV practitioners. Some examples are very simple, and I will use, for example, the part of Syria where until a few months ago, we had a very complex system in terms of communication options between GBV service providers in general. So we had 3 different referral pathways, for instance, for GBV service and service mapping, and it was very difficult for the 3 to communicate among them. From December 2024, because of the change in the political environment, this came all together. But of course, the needs there to bring together over 100 partners to merge referral pathways and harmonize the information that we send out, and we need to send out in a very fast way. If we didn't have technology, obviously, it was going to be much more complicated. So the use of digital service mapping tools and digital referral pathways, interactive dashboard really is a very good way for us to use technology to speed up this kind of response in rapidly evolving emerging context, obviously keeping into account all the aspects of confidentiality, data sharing that we don't need to breach. This revealed very useful and is still very useful as we are still in a transition phase in Syria. Another example is the use of virtual women and girls safe spaces models to continue facilitating information about GBV prevention, GBV risk mitigation, and also link with GBV response services. One of the most famous digital or virtual WGSS models is LAHA, that has been adopted now in many, many countries of the world, and many of them, of course, are also emergency humanitarian contexts. One of them is Syria. End process. Why virtual models are very important? Because again, in rapid evolving emergency context, all the static facilities, all the static and even the mobile women and girls safe spaces, community centers and stuff might not be accessible, might be closed, might be destroyed because of the emergency. So obviously the information and the same access to service will be completely disrupted. Having the possibility of continuing this type of information sharing through online platforms is quite relevant. The third and last example that I want to talk about today is not related to Syria, but it's about digitalizing case management systems for GBV survivors. And it's an example from Gaza. In Gaza, as you know, probably at the moment, this is the most devastated emergency context. Over 90% of the population is displaced, and the destruction is also almost total. So definitely, this is one of the cases where service provision is not possible in the conventional way. We don't have static facilities anymore. So the team of GBV service providers, the service providers, put together a pilot to initiate a fully paperless case management system. So this is not only a remote case management system, which is not new. We have used remote case management in many contexts before, with COVID, with rapid onset emergencies, earthquakes, floods. This is remote case management, paperless. It means the service providers, the case managers, are not using intake forms, referral forms in the traditional way. And they are also moving from the laptop to the phone, because also the staff has serious challenges in terms of having equipment. In most cases, the laptops can get lost, or it's not easy to carry laptops with them when they're also fleeing as service providers. And this is also important to remember in acute emergency context. Is not only GBV survivors or population at risk, it's also the case managers, the service providers. So the use of the phones as the only way of getting information on the case obviously requires simplification of the tools, because there's no way you can use the phone screen to compile the original full intake form or referral form. So challenges around this is that obviously there is need to continue investing in technical support to adapt the tools for mobile-based case management. So food for thought, but nevertheless, this is an example that really can be scaled up in many other contexts and rapid crisis context. Over to you, Veronique.
Thank you so much, Verena. These are great examples of how technology can actually be capitalized upon to make systems work better. And I really like your examples of trying to coordinate referral pathways with 100 partners and how technology is essential for this. I thought that was quite striking. Thank you so much. I'll now go to Caitlin. You work with UNICEF in Ukraine, and Ukraine is considered one of the most technologically advanced humanitarian responses. How is tech shaping the Ukraine response? And may I just remind all speakers before I hand over to Caitlin to speak slowly because we do have interpretation. And I will also try and remind myself of that. Caitlin, over to you.
Thank you so much. Indeed, from the conduct of hostilities in Ukraine to the humanitarian response, and as I will speak to later, the protection risks that are facing children here, Ukraine really stands at the forefront of what is possible in a highly digitalized environment. I want to start by walking you through a few examples of how technology shapes the day-to-day here. This morning, like many living in Ukraine, I woke up without electricity. As some of you may have heard, we are having quite significant attacks on the energy infrastructure here, which has led to rolling blackouts lasting in some cases up to 12 hours a day. And unfortunately, we anticipate that this will last throughout this winter. An hour later, after I woke up, I paid for my morning coffee with a QR code because everything in Ukraine is done by QR code at a coffee shop that was powered by a generator. And then I was able to check the website of my local electricity provider that showed me the up-to-date information about power outages in my neighborhood and all of the surrounding neighborhoods. And so this type of really coordinated and reliable information allows government and humanitarian service providers to plan around when they will and won't have electricity each day, and to activate our business continuity plans as needed to be able to do the work that we need to do. Across the country, we're alerted to the risk of airstrikes by an app on our phone that tells us when the airstrikes may come, what the risk is, and when that risk is elevated. And we use Telegram channels to provide us with real-time updates about the nature of these possible attacks. In the middle of the night, being able to see where the drones are in your city, if they're in your neighborhood specifically, and that really enables people to make decisions for themselves and their families about how to best manage risk, how to take care of their children, whether it's better to wake them up or let them sleep. And it also informs, of course, when we carry out our humanitarian operations, when we need to postpone things, and when we need to take a different route or approach. Beyond empowering civilians and humanitarians with the information they need to stay safe, of course, digitalization has enabled some unique response modalities for those affected. Ukraine has a very advanced digital identification platform called DIA that provides digital IDs, passports, and other key documents. And this has really enabled documentation to be restored quickly in the case of it being damaged or destroyed as a result of the conflict. And it's also a way for people to apply for financial assistance and other compensation due to war-related damage or incidents. In the most conflict-affected communities, hundreds of thousands of children are still receiving either completely online education or hybrid modalities, so part online and part in person. And then when it comes to protection-specific response, I'm glad that my colleague mentioned the LAHA virtual safe spaces. We also have women and girls safe spaces through LAHA that are tailored to the Ukrainian context, where girls and women can access information about sexual and reproductive health, GBV, and also where the specific services are in their communities. And this extends to women and girls that are refugees living outside of Ukraine, so in the surrounding countries. Additionally, we have, through a UNICEF-supported partner, digital mental health and psychosocial support, so children and families can access short-term or longer-term individual counseling, group support sessions, and other types of MHPSS modalities, depending on what their needs may be for the duration that they may have those needs. So in the interest of time, let me stop there. In a place like Ukraine, there are countless other examples, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a snapshot of just how embedded technology is into the everyday here in Ukraine. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Katie, and we'll come back to you for more as we go along. Now, we've had these reflections on how technology can be an enabler of humanitarian community responses. Since the Humanitarian Reset, many organizations have turned even more to technology, in particular artificial intelligence, to improve the efficiencies and to help us navigate funding shortfalls. I'd like to now turn to Susie. Susie, so as well as working with CDAC, you're also the founder of The Machine Race and named in the 100 Brilliant Women in Artificial Intelligence Ethics in 2025. It certainly feels like there are AI proponents everywhere in the humanitarian system. Can you explain to us what do we mean when we're talking about AI, and why should protection actors be talking about it? Over to you.
Of course. Well, hi, Veronique, and hello to everybody online. Great to be with you all today. So, yes, I mean, clearly AI is everywhere. You can't turn on the TV or the radio without hearing about it. And I think when we're talking about humanitarian context, we can really see it from two perspectives. So that's AI within now affected communities, environments. It's part of the context. And also AI being used within humanitarian responses. So what is AI? Well, in fact, kind of unhelpfully, there is actually no agreed definition of artificial intelligence, but it's usually used to describe when a machine or a system performs tasks that would usually require human or other biological brain power to accomplish. But I think it's probably more useful to maybe think about some of the different typologies of artificial intelligence. Now, for most of us online, probably the one that we think of most quickly is generative AI. So that's where you use a prompt to create text or video or images. So ChatGPT probably being the most familiar one. And one of the highest use cases of these generative models is actually people using that kind of generative AI for advice, which is really important for us as humanitarians and protection actors. Because the thing about the different types of artificial intelligence is, and the different types of AI use cases, is that it opens up different types of risk. So with that kind of generative AI, there's a real risk around disinformation and misinformation, as we've heard from places like Sudan and Ukraine, and also deep fakes, I'm sure people have heard of. So a recent study showed that 99% of deep fakes are pornographic. And actually, and when generative AI is used to superimpose images onto explicit material, 99% of the victims are women and are of women and girls. Another type of AI is predictive analytics and forecasting, so different to generative AI. And that's where it can forecast future outcomes using historical data or pattern recognition. So that could be very useful for disaster preparedness, for example. But the risks there are, what happens if there is false confidence or bias in the data, which could lead to discrimination. It can also be, what happens if there's bias and it's being used to decide whether or not somebody receives social welfare from the government, or indeed humanitarian assistance. So different risks again. A third one is computer vision. So if we think about AI that interprets images or video, so there's an opportunity there to spot disaster damage very quickly, actually, as it was used in the Turkey earthquake, to understand, to have satellite imagery analysis and so on. But at the same time, that same kind of AI can be used for surveillance. It can also be blind to certain contexts and not really understand, give a false picture of what's actually happening. We also have natural language processing, which is involved in that generative AI we were talking about. But that AI understands human language. So we see that a lot in translation, in AI assistance, but also transcription services. And I see already that there are some of those summary tools like Fireflies recording this and all our data that we're saying on the call today. And there's also agentic AI agents. And so AI agents take autonomous or independent action towards goals. So absolutely fantastic for things like, booking, well, fantastic, well, we'll see. But the idea is that, it can easily book your travel for you or manage your calendar and things like this. So some huge opportunities there. But so it's not just answering questions, but actually doing things autonomously. But there's real kind of concerns there about privacy and cybersecurity and actually a loss of control. So there are others, but like recommendation systems, autonomous systems, foundation models. But anyway, this isn't. I won't carry on with the AI 101 today. That'll be for another session. But in terms of the second part of the question, now, why should protection actors be talking about AI and skilling up on artificial intelligence? Well, Veronique, as you rightly pointed out, the humanitarian sector is at a crisis point right now, facing catastrophic funding cuts, increasing needs, shrinking civil society space, all the pressure of the humanitarian reset. And so quite often, AI seems like the shiny solution to reach more people with less money. And the risk with that is that we are racing towards unsafe AI deployments to cut costs with serious unintended consequences for vulnerable populations. And actually, what we're seeing as the current reality is, individuals using particularly generative AI without any guardrails and without any guidance, actually, from senior leadership. And when there are AI projects, those pilots are happening in silos and so on. So there is actually a real opportunity here for protection actors, and I believe this so passionately. And I would love everybody to go away from this call feeling really empowered about what you can contribute towards more safer and more inclusive AI. Because ultimately, protection principles and AI governance can't be separated. And protection staff can really be the essential kind of brakes on things and the guide, ensuring that there is no harm committed with AI or really mitigating the risk, whilst actually realizing the efficiencies and benefits that AI can bring. And of course, protection staff have real expertise to offer here, because risk mitigation is, it's bread and butter for protection actors. Protection actors, we're so used to assessing diverse risks across diverse groups. And there are those core protection competencies that really directly translate into AI risk mitigation, from accountability to affected people, that understanding of international humanitarian law, thinking about privacy, data protection, inclusion principles, leave no one behind. So actually, and also protection staff are so used to kind of, conducting really critical contextual analysis, conflict sensitivity, gender analysis, of course, political economy analysis. And all of this contextual understanding is really essential for responsible AI. And the technical teams, and perhaps the IT teams and sometimes digital teams, can really, really benefit from that. So we need that cross-functional working together. So just to kind of wrap up here, the organizations really need to empower protection experts like those on the call in relation to artificial intelligence. And protection actors can feel confidence because you don't actually need to be an AI and machine learning technological wizard and expert. Just some capacity building around how some of these AI typologies work, and it might be simpler than you think. and an empowerment by senior leaders to be allowed to spot where AI risks might emerge in that AI life cycle. And you can think of an AI life cycle like a program life cycle. So it's that capacity building and really helping protection staff to spot those unintended consequences and the potential trade-offs that might happen with AI from that intersectional perspective. And one tiny example of that, if you invest in AI education tools rather than teachers, for example, could be a great idea, but also who will be there to be that one trusted adult a child can turn to if they're being abused at home? I'll stop there. Thanks, Veronique.
Thank you so much, Susie. I definitely learned a lot. It was a very good overview of AI 101. But also, I really like this final message you have around protection actors feeling they have the capacities to do this and that it doesn't require huge amounts of expertise and retraining, but actually a little bit of capacity building. As you said, some support from management, and then go ahead, you have that ability to analyze risk, to understand how, context, conflict, gender sensitivity, inclusion, and all these unintended consequences can happen. So really great message there. Now I'm going to apologize to a lot of our panelists because I'm going to switch things around a little bit as we are running away with time. And first, I'm going to go to Alice, who has not spoken yet, and maybe not with the questions you expected, as I am shifting things around a little. But Alice, I wanted to ask, so in Sudan and Ukraine, as well as many countries from Palestine to Colombia, humanitarians are reporting the increase in the use of AI-assisted drones, and your organization, Diaconia, has been reflecting on drone use and IHL. Can you share more about this and some of the work you're doing around this? Over to you, Alice.
Yes, of course. Thank you, and lovely to be with you. I apologize if I cut out. I'm also in Ukraine at the moment, so in terms of the power cuts, they're definitely affecting connectivity here. But in terms of, the question that you posed about the use of AI within drones, I'm going to just say a few words firstly to clarify, because drones is such an enormous term. What I will be speaking about is the use of manned drones, not autonomous weapon systems, which are drone based. They are fully autonomous weapon systems are a very, very distinct legal issue, ethical issue as well. And the fact of the matter is that to date, their reported use is in dispute, and if they are being used, it is exceptionally limited and probably unlikely. So when it comes to armed drones as a weapon system, they would fall under the normal rules of IHL that govern all use of weapon systems. So they are distinction, proportionality, and precaution. So armed drones must, of course, comply with those rules. The concern that's raised by the use of armed drones is the fact that operationally and politically, they make the use of force potentially easier because of the fact that you do not have a human who is directly in the battlefield and could be subject to a reprisal or attack within it. There is far less risk to the armed operator because there could be potentially hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers away from the actual conduct of the hostilities. So therefore, it can make recourse to force potentially easier. In terms of the positives, though, there is also, where they we are used for surveillance of an area of active conflict. They can mean that you have a better understanding of where combatants are, of where enemy fighters are, of where your military target is, and crucially, where civilian populations are and the movements of local civilian populations, their daily life patterns, civilian infrastructure, which of course must be protected under IHL in any use of force, including by armed drones. So there are also opportunities there when it comes to the use of armed drones in conflict settings to maybe provide a little bit more certainty around attacks and allow greater protection of civilians in the area. In terms of humanitarian access, indeed, there are, of course, huge concerns and challenges around the fact that drones could be used, surveillance drones could be used to monitor civilians' access to humanitarian services, to track local groups who might be ethnic minorities, who are being targeted by enemy forces as it is. And of course, to intimidate humanitarian service providers themselves, who are concerned rightly for their own safety, as well as the provision of humanitarian services. So of course, there are great challenges there. I don't think the challenges that can't be overcome. I think that, you know, with regulation, over both the use of the drone and use of airspace, and much tightening of a regulation around that, but also in terms of their production. So under IHL, if the drone is a weapon system, it would have to go through what's called an Article 36 review to see if it can be used in compliance with IHL. It's not inherently capable of being used in a cruel or to cause unnecessary suffering. But in terms of, in the wider questions about drone surveillance drones, of course, we need to make sure that they are of sufficient quality, that they can be tracked, that they're traceable, ideally that they have, you know, manufacturing systems and numbers. That means that they can't be used anonymously. That's another big concern. I know that where drones are becoming cheaper and more readily available, they are falling into armed actors' hands, non-state armed actors who could potentially be using them to disrupt humanitarian services. And again, that's why it's so important that we can track them and trace them, and that they are where they are being deployed, we know that they are of quality. They're not just going to fall out the sky, and they have council systems, etc., in them if they are weaponized.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice. Again, I feel like I'm learning a lot through this. I hope our audience is also learning. I also wanted just to talk a little bit about the chat. There's a vibrant conversation, lots of questions there. And also to our panelists, if you feel like you want to answer some of those questions, please feel free, as we won't have time, unfortunately, for Q&A. But now I'd like to come back to Verena. There's a growing discussion, as we've seen, around the use of AI, and in particular around the use of AI-assisted mental health chatbots and humanitarian response. And I wondered, how is this perceived by gender-based violence actors and in that sector? So over to you, Verena.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Veronique. Great question. The answer is not that good, unfortunately, how it is perceived. And I'm going to make reference to a recent report, an analysis that was led by Caroline Masbunji and Sarah Spencer. It was just published, and I will share it with you. It's right about this topic. So they conducted this analysis on the evidence on how chatbots support is effective to support mental health and psychosocial support in the specialized GBV response. So unfortunately, the analysis is showing more evidence that chatbots can support, for instance, clients that are facing loneliness, but there is less evidence that the same chatbots can support GBV trauma, depression, and other mental consequences. And what are the challenges of these chatbots and the use of these chatbots? The main point is these sound like human, but they're not human. So they cannot replace the specialized services of somebody who can provide specialized MHPSS. So there are about 6 reasons that were identified in the analysis why we need more work for us to make sure these chatbots are in line with standards. The first reason is that, and this you can rely to it because it happens also to everybody, to all of us, when we use ChatGPT, for instance. The first one is sometimes the chatbots go offline because of network or have lack of capacity to respond to certain questions, and in this particular case, to abuse. So imagine what this can create if I am a GBV survivor and I'm asking the chatbot, please, I need support. This not only is very brutal for the survivor, but it's also creating lack of trust in the service, which is not going to help us in our conversation around timely reporting, timely access to services. The second point is the lack of confidentiality, privacy, and consent. Even though most of these chatbots are saying that the data will not be shared and they will be kept confidential, if you dig down and analyze what happens to the data, some of them might then eventually use the data to improve the services, which basically means breaching all our principles about confidentiality and privacy of the survivors. The third point is, to me, the most important, is the safety and do no harm. Unfortunately, some of these chatbots have inaccurate inputs. They have a huge lack of accountability to affected population, and this happens when what they call the safeguards, so the way the systems are programmed to not respond in a certain way, for instance, to not respond with more violence, they get broken for some reasons. And then there are some examples where the chatbot is responding back, inciting violence, inciting suicide. These are very not acceptable ways of course, using the chatbot, because it can, and these are documented cases where somebody is seeking for support and ends up suiciding. The other point is the lack of cultural adaptation. And this really applies not only to chatbots, but to any tool that we use for case management, for response to trauma events. If the chatbot language is not adapted to different contexts, different countries, and different ways of talking about violence, we might not get very much information from the survivors so that the chatbot can help them seek the services that they need. In a country like Syria, for instance, there might be a different way of saying I've been abused than in East Africa or in Latin America. So it is very important that whoever is programming or working on the chatbots programming is contextualizing. Limited survivor-centered participatory design is also another reason why we cannot, I mean, the analysis is also flagging that we can't say these are fully designed based on the needs of those who are going to use them. And the last point I think is also very interesting is what we call the dopamine effect. Again, this can happen to us, to all of us, also when we use chatbots that are not specialized for GBV or protection response. When you get so much empathy that you isolate yourself within the conversation with the chatbot, it becomes your best friend somehow, right? But is this really in line with the empowerment and the agency that we want to promote when it comes also to GBV survivors? It's not, because you might end up in more isolation than before and not be able to seek services and get out of the cycle of violence. So in conclusion, chatbots again, and I want to echo also what Susie mentioned, the use of chatbots and technology for service provision is really growing because of different reasons, emergencies, access, but recently also because of the funding cuts. We should not make these decisions just only because of the funding cuts. The most important point for us should be the do no harm. So if it's something that is going to harm, then we need to work more on it so that they can assist specialized, in this case, mental health, psychosocial support personnel, not replace them completely. I will pause it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verena. Lots of very, very critical points, and I can't even imagine myself. I get very impatient with chatbots when I'm doing banking, which let alone can't imagine being in a traumatic situation, looking for help, being desperate for that help, and then having to interact with a chatbot that doesn't quite fit my language or might. The example you gave about incitation to suicide is quite critical. Yeah, and your last point, do no harm first over efficiency and cutting costs, very, very critical. And the point that quite a lot of you have mentioned. I'd like to come back to Caitlin now. And sorry again, I am switching around all your talking. But Caitlin, returning to you, while the Ukraine response can build on technology, and use this to strengthen the response. In your role with UNICEF, You are also witnessing an increase in digital harm affecting children. Could you elaborate a bit more on this, please? And also, I think you've also had, and I think you mentioned it earlier, there is some issues around having, there are clear frameworks in place for children that are physically mobilized into armed groups, but much less so around online mobilization. So can you also elaborate a little bit more around how authorities reacting to online mobilization in Ukraine? Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so here in Ukraine, we are witnessing a very concerning phenomenon that's really at the intersection of children in armed conflict, justice for children, and online exploitation. Messaging apps, especially Telegram and other types of online games, have become an entry point for conflict-related use of children. So what does this mean in practice? Essentially, children are being approached by strangers online. Usually in our context, we're seeing this through Telegram channels that promote, or promise easy money for simple tasks. So these kids are on these groups looking for a quick buck. And they are approached by handlers who are offering, small financial incentives to them to do tasks that appear to the children to be harmless. So taking photos of police cars or military objects, sharing GPS coordinates, delivering packages from unknown people. The handlers will often tell children that because they're children, they won't be prosecuted for their actions, that they're not able to be held criminally responsible. And so what tends to happen is that over time, the tasks that children are asked to engage in escalate in the severity, going into arson attacks, building explosives, and we've seen cases here with really extreme consequences. There's one very well documented case where two teenagers were tasked to blow up a railway line, and tragically one of the children died and the other lost his legs when the explosives were remotely detonated. So they were carrying these explosives, they were remotely detonated, and the children were killed and injured. The information that we've seen and the conversations we've had suggests that that these children are rarely doing this for ideological reasons. They're not carrying out tasks because of some belief or conviction or anti-state sentiment. It really does come down to the money. You have children that are in difficult life circumstances, but you also have children from a variety of family backgrounds that are kind of taken by the idea of making money quickly. They believe that it's safe to do, and then they end up getting coerced. There's also really alarming cases of particularly girls being blackmailed with intimate photos that they've shared or that have been obtained somehow, and then those girls are basically coerced into carrying out some of these actions at the request of these handlers because those photos are there. And I think, just to say that we see this, although this is a very kind of new and specific type of use of children in conflict, we do see that children around the world in all conflicts are really the targets of recruitment and use so often. And this is because, as protection actors, you'll know this, but they are neurologically and emotionally still developing. Their brains are really wired to seek reward and excitement, but their risk assessing capabilities are not fully mature until they're young adults. And so this makes them particularly susceptible to these types of requests, and it's exacerbated by the digital nature, the dopamine hit, the immediate responses and engagement that they're having, the feeling of excitement that they're doing something that's a little bit outside of what they should be doing. And so here in this context, I think this happens in any situation. Parents are dealing with this all over the world in different forms, but war really compounds these vulnerabilities. So the disruption to family environments, protective environments, schools and communities, but then also the increased financial stress that families and children are under, social isolation, you know, kids going to school online and not being able to interact with their peers, and the significant mental health pressures that children have faced going from years of COVID straight into, you know, now almost 4 years of conflict here in Ukraine. So children are really even more exposed than they would be otherwise. And I think, you know, we especially see with adolescents, especially boys who, you know, are facing the risk of conscription as they get older, that life is really uncertain, really dominated by fear and lack of opportunity. And so when these, you know, quick financial opportunities come through, it's really hard for children to resist. So all this to say, children are really being targeted because they are vulnerable, and we really need to prioritize looking at these children primarily as victims, not as perpetrators, not as terrorists, etc. So maybe to pivot to the kind of second question in terms of how authorities are responding to this here. I mean, it's obviously not a case of kind of traditional recruitment and use where you would, you know, demobilize children and reintegrate them in the same way. But the government has really taken a strong approach to prevention and awareness raising in communities, with children directly, with their parents, trying to stop this exploitation before it starts, and to make sure that when children are approached, they know how to report this type of activity so that it can be followed up on by the authorities. It's really important that these types of prevention measures, though, remain child-friendly, that they're not stigmatizing, that they're not overly securitized, and that children are not being kind of portrayed as threats to the state as a result of you know, being kind of caught up in this behavior. Also, just to say, I think we do see a good attempt by the government to apply child-friendly justice procedures, but unfortunately, many of these children are being charged with state security-related crimes, high treason, etc., which have a lower minimum age of criminal responsibility and harsher penalties. So we're really advocating, you know, for these children to be treated primarily as victims, to take a rehabilitative and restorative justice approach rather than a punitive one. We know that children, just as they are easily susceptible to these types of recruitment attempts, that they all also have the resilience and capacity to rebound, to readjust, to get back on the right track. And so it's really critical that we're approaching children through that lens. And then finally, the government here has, within the context of the UN Security Council's Children and Armed Conflict Agenda, they've signed what's called a Joint Prevention Plan to end and prevent grave violations against children. This is a voluntary plan. It's not something that they're required to do within the context of the Security Council agenda, and it really shows their commitment to strengthening conflict-affected children. But just to say, there are dedicated activities within this plan related to preventing recruitment and use of children online, as well as ensuring that there are child-friendly approaches to justice. And so we're really pleased to be able to work with the government here within this framework on these specific issues. You know, I think it's there's a lot of potential there, and a lot of good effort being put in, but really, you know, an alarming trend, and something that we worry, even if the war does end, that this type of, you know, instrumentalization of children could continue, and we are even seeing it happening outside of Ukraine's borders in other surrounding states. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. That's quite something new in terms of child protection and thinking about very, very specific and new risks with online mobilization. Thank you for this. Before I go to Susie and Joel to finish us, to help us conclude for today, I'd like to quickly go back to Alice, because some of your work, I understand you also look at some of the concerns around AI and inclusion. So I'd like to come back to you a little bit on this and how what these concerns are around artificial intelligence and inclusion. I will ask you to keep your intervention a bit short as we're really coming close to the end, but over to you, Alice.
Yeah,
Okay, sure. No, I can keep that very, very brief. And maybe I'm being a bit, I'm sorry if I'm being pessimistic, and Susie, please, in your intervention after me, you can tell me how wrong I am, but I am incredibly concerned about the fact already we have massive gaps in our data in our protection data. We are nowhere near ready to collect inclusive data. I haven't seen any data set ever on civilian harm, casualties more generally within conflict that does incorporate infants, is disaggregated by age, older persons with disabilities, and not just visible disabilities, persons with psychosocial impairments, intellectual impairments, ethnic minorities, linguistic minorities, LGBTQ+ communities. All of these groups are currently excluded from most data sets, and therefore are excluded from most data programming, protection programming and responses. And I am very concerned that we could bake in that exclusion when we now start to develop algorithms, etc., around protection data. And of course, those biases, once they're baked in, or those exclusions, once they're baked in, I suspect would be hard to remove. So yeah, I'm sorry to be the pessimist, because of course, I do see the opportunities there as well. But I think we have to proceed with caution, because as I said, we're not in a good place as we are right now. And I truly believe that, no data is better than bad data. Bad data leaves already vulnerable groups further behind.
Thank you so much, Alice, for this point. I do quite a lot of research on inclusive humanitarian action, and that's definitely the biases are also built in current ways that the humanitarian sector works. I can't imagine that AI would be any different. But it'd be really interesting to explore that further, and how we could actually maybe build AI that's much more inclusive. So we're coming to the end of our session, and we've had such good information from all of you. And I hope our audience has been able to follow my slightly frantic moderation, going back and forth on different topics. But I think it's been absolutely fantastic. And our panelists have set a picture on the many technologies and use of technologies and how it shapes the protection landscape. So I'd like to come back to Susie first. In practical terms, AI is now a commonly used tool. I'm sure you would not advocate that people do not use AI. So can you share some reflections on the safe use of AI? Over to you, Susie.
Thanks, Veronique. I'll try and spin through this, bearing in mind we did an entire panel on this question the other day, but I will try. So some reflections on the safe use of AI. I would rephrase that and say we can only talk about the safer use of AI. There is no such thing as safe AI, and I only say that as a provocation because I think where we are really, and Alice has just laid out, very articulately, some really serious risks with it, that we are in a situation where we need to mitigate risks. Yes, there are huge amounts of opportunity, but we need to be very clear-eyed about it. So in terms of what responsible AI use looks like, well, despite the fact that AI can do some incredible things, organizations also really need to encourage staff to have the permission to say no to AI. AI is not always the answer, and that is perfectly legitimate to analyze and think that. And sometimes the solution to accelerating girls' education, for example, is not about an AI education tool. It's actually about tackling gender inequality. So really the key message here is about start with identifying the problem and then see if there's a good tech solution, not the other way around. I'm going to spin through some essential foundations for organizations thinking about using AI. Of course, number one, AI has to be embedded. So AI design, deployment and use, procurement as well. Embed it within humanitarian principles, as I talked before. core humanitarian standards, accountability to affected populations. So that requires work, thinking how do those things overlay with each other, interact. Number two, that means that senior leadership has to be accountable. Who is in charge of AI safety and inclusion? The meaningful inclusion of communities throughout the AI lifecycle, and who is accountable if it goes wrong. There needs to be clear AI governance policies, including for simple use of chatbots, ChatGPT and so on. So, that's, what staff can and cannot use it for. That is combined also those governance policies with data privacy and confidentiality protocols, data ethics. Who owns that data? Who owns their own, individual, so-called beneficiary data? And AI literacy training to understand what responsible AI and participatory AI looks like. And as I said before, multidisciplinary teams to spot those risks. So I realized, and there's more I could talk to. Now, I realized with all of this that it can actually all sound overwhelming. Where do you start? And sometimes people are frozen between the fear of missing out and the fear of doing harm. So CDAC Network, who I'm working with at the moment, is working on what's called the Safe AI Project. So that stands for Standards and Assurance Framework for Ethical AI. That's with the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK AI Institute, and Humanitarian AI Advisory. So we're developing a suite of practical tools to help organizations get a hold of this, because now we need to move beyond high-level principles and actually have concrete tools about helping people move through that AI lifecycle. So there are a few different tools within that. They're on their way, they're coming out, they're in beta version at the moment, and not all are on the CDAC website yet, but they'll be coming over the next few months. So there's a lot of guidance in there about participation. How do we involve communities meaningfully through the cycle? We take people through the AI implementation journey to map the decision points along the way. We also have a glossary and also a guide to crossing languages between technologists and humanitarians. What do we all mean? Sometimes we use the same words but mean different things. There's an impact assessment tool in there to help you kind of decide, what are the implications of this? And there's procurement guidance as well. So lots of things out there. So suffice to say, community engagement and AI assurance has costs to it. But if we mean what we say about being accountable to affected communities and putting them in the driving seat, we cannot cut corners with AI, not in high-risk contexts. And similarly, with AI assurance, you would not buy a car, you would not board an aeroplane if you didn't know that that had servicing and safety certificates. And so too is it with AI.
Great. Thank you, Susie, for all this. I'm now going to quickly go to Joelle to help us finish off with some reflections. What reflections would you share with protection actors on how they can operate in the digital age? Over to you for these final reflections.
Thank you, Veronique. It's quite difficult to come in after all this really rich contributions from all the colleagues. And in a way, it really mirrors how complex and how every aspect of our operations, you see technology having an impact, whether it's positive or negative. And it poses back the question at us, where is our role as protection actors? And how do we bridge that role also with regulation actors, with digital risks, with digital rights organizations, with technical organizations, and really moving beyond only identifying the risks or rushing to adopt different technologies when not enough risk assessments have been integrated, not enough technical standards have been even formulated, let alone adopted. So I'll take it back maybe to sum up, and I know we're out of time to sum up on the question of, are we as teams ready for this type of operationalization of protection work that intends to address digital risks? So in your own team ask the question, is everyone conversational enough? Does everyone have the right interlocutors at your level? And does your leadership also is up to date to what the risks that matter to your organization from your expertise and mandate? And are we actually ready to engage in these conversations or recommendations or workshops or any type of operational response, whether it is adoption of tools or whether it's actually identifying harms specifically to children, to groups with specific vulnerabilities? Have we actually mapped out this risk and identified where our role is as protection actors? So I think there's a long way ahead of us, and there's a big learning curve ahead of our teams as well. It's not very encouraging that we're having this conversation at times where everybody's cutting resources. So I hope that at least from a point of view of remaining relevant as protection actors, that we are able to integrate digital risks into our operations.
Thank you so much, Joelle, for these concluding reflections. I want to thank all our panelists today for these amazing interventions. I also want to thank you for your patience with me, and for, as some of you know, I had to cut a few questions and jump around. But I think it was such a wonderful, wonderful session. I also want to thank all the participants who've put lots of really interesting questions and contributions and thoughts in the chat. I think it would be really great to look over that, which is really hard to do when you're moderating, but a big thank you. And also thank you for the organizers and the translators for bearing with us, sometimes speaking too fast. A big thank you to all of you, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Merci, merci, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
That was very useful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup, bye-bye.
Very useful.
Thank
you. Bye-bye. Very interesting.
Merci,
I'm
merci
going
beaucoup.
to use AI after
Thank
this.
you so much. No AI. Bye-bye.
Ah, la 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 la.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.